Welcome to Hometown Happenings. I'm Carol McCarthy, and I'm standing here lakeside with Dr. John Madsen from Mississippi State University. And he is here. We're going to talk a little bit about what he's doing. He's studying flowering rush here in Detroit Lakes. The Pelican River Watershed District has hired you and a team of researchers to study flowering rush. And Dr. Madsen, why don't you tell us a little bit about what exactly you are doing?
Okay, our immediate team is working on 4 different parts of the project. The first is we're looking at the seasonal growth pattern of flowering rush and its ability to store starch in its rhizomes during the spring and summer. We use that information to try and determine how early we can control flowering rush, because you can only control flowering rush when it's actively growing, as well as to look at if we can possibly deplete the starch by repeated management operations like harvesting the plant or cutting the plant or using herbicides. Okay. So that's the first part. The second part is we're looking at the distribution of flowering rush with depth, because that's a persistent question, is how far out does it grow and how much of it is growing above the water surface at each depth versus below the water surface. When you have a plant in shallow water like that, where there's a lot of material that's coming up above the water surface, it's very easy to treat it with by spraying an herbicide on the foliage, and that will control the plant. But as you go farther out into deeper water, there's less and less proportion of the leaf that's above the water, and it becomes more difficult to apply an herbicide to the foliage and get good control. So that's the second part of the study. The third part is to look at the distribution of flowering rush in the native plants across the entire Detroit Lake system. So we did a whole lake survey and also took sediment samples, because sediment type is one of the characteristics that tends to control what kind of plants are growing at that location, so sediment and depth. And then the fourth thing is we did do a trial of a management technique in Detroit Lake, where we treated using an herbicide called endothol at different frequencies to see if we could get control with that particular herbicide applied to the water. And so those are the 4 components. We're working with Dr. Michelle Marco of Concordia College, who's providing a number of students to assist in sampling, and she is in charge of some aspects of the study, along with myself and a graduate student from Mississippi State University.
Okay. Now, the initial, I know the City Council has been talking about this, Detroit Lake City Council, what to do with the flowering rush, and one of the issues was that it's never been really studied. And your college actually has studied flowering rush, or is this a first of its kind?
Well, the flowering rush does not have a history of research and a body of knowledge about it. There have been some studies looking at the genetics of flowering rush, but not even the basic ecology and distribution, where it grows, where it doesn't grow, how it spreads. There are all sorts of questions about flowering rush that we need to understand to effectively manage it. This plant is not like Eurasian water milfoil, which has a 50 or 60 year history of research on it. There are very few publications on it. For instance, we don't even know what kind of herbicides are effective in controlling it. So we are doing a study on this plant in Montana right now and in Idaho. So that's one reason why we are asked to assist with this study.
You're in tune to Hometown Happenings here. I'm Carol McCarthy with Dr. John Madsen, and we're standing here lakeside in Detroit Lakes talking about the flowering rush. Dr. Madsen is leading a group along with another researcher from Concordia College, and we're talking about what some of the things they're finding and what more research you need to do. And we're going to take a quick break and be back with more Hometown Happenings after this. Welcome back to Hometown Happenings. I'm here with Dr. John Madsen from Mississippi State University. He is among some researchers studying flowering rush here in Detroit Lake. We are plagued with the stuff, and Dr. Madsen has been here. When did you actually come into town and start studying this?
We actually first started studying this plant in mid-May. We are sampling, looking at the seasonal growth patterns. We're sampling about every 3 weeks through the growing season, and then we'll actually be sampling through the ice to try and look at some overwintering starch content of the rhizome. So we're sampling throughout the calendar year, and we expect to be back next year continuing to sample that seasonal growth pattern study. It's really too early to say much about what we've learned. We have seen that the repeated treatment with the Endothall does seem to be effective in reducing the abundance of the plant, but there's a lot more to understand there. Now, there are some other groups working on flowering rush aside from Concordia College and myself. The city and Pelican River Watershed also contracted with the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center, and they're doing a whole suite of studies looking at what herbicides are effective on flowering rush, looking at about 12 different aquatic herbicides that are approved by EPA to control aquatic plants. We have a small portion of that study as well that we're doing at our facility in Mississippi State University. So we need to understand what herbicides are effective, what other control techniques might work, and analyze some of the data that we've collected this summer.
Okay. Dr. Madsen is my guest today on Hometown Happenings. We're talking about the flowering rush here in Detroit Lake. We can see some of it behind us, and you know, it's been here for what 20? It started in the 70s, and now in your studies in Montana and also Iowa, you said, is it spread to the extent that this lake is seeing, or is it worse there? Or?
This is one of the first lakes where it's a widespread problem, and it seemed to be an isolated case. The other lake that has a very widespread problem with flowering rush is Flathead Lake in Montana, which is right next to Glacier National Park. So the two lakes appear very different. At this point, flowering rush now is starting to spread down the Flathead River into the lower Clark Fork River and on into downstream into the Columbia River. So it's spreading downstream in that system. We haven't seen that sort of spread yet in Minnesota, but certainly that's a possibility.
Okay, all right. And is there any effect, obviously, on the underwater life, the aquatic life, and the lake life that you're finding? That's some debate at this point. Some of the fisheries people think that it's maybe good habitat. Certainly it's a big nuisance if you're a lakeshore user, if you're a boater. You get caught in the flowering rush, and it has a very thick fibrous leaf that ties up in your propeller, and it's hard to move through. So in terms of its nuisance aspect, it's a very problematic plant. And certainly with other invasive aquatic plants, we see that they displace desirable native plant species that provide food for waterfowl and habitat for fish. All right. Dr. John Madsen from Mississippi State University is among researchers studying flowering rush here in Detroit Lake, and your research is going to continue. Now, you've described basically this summer and next summer. Is it going to continue until there's some major discovery, or is it an ongoing thing?
Well, to some extent, the research will be ongoing, but the main findings we hope to achieve in the next year or two will be the timing of good applications of herbicides, most likely, and then what herbicides are effective on the plant, both that it's above the water and herbicides that might be used in the water.
All right, Dr. John Madsen, and we'll be meeting with you again, I'm sure, to check back in and to see what you're up to with the studying of the flowering rush. And for Hometown Happenings, along with Dr. Madsen, I'm Carol McCarthy on TV3.